From the outside, Prince looked like freedom made visible. Color, excess, provocation, endless reinvention. But behind the spectacle was a man governed by rules so strict they bordered on obsession. Rules he wrote for everyone around him and, eventually, rules that closed in on himself. Control came first, always. Prince did not merely make music. He owned it in a way few artists ever attempted. He fought record labels not for higher royalties, but for authorship, for custody of his own sound. Contracts were prisons to him. Masters were lives. When he scrawled "slave" across his face in the mid-1990s, it wasn't a metaphor meant for headlines, it was a warning. His vault of unreleased music grew into legend not because he couldn't release it, but because he refused to unless conditions were exact, sacred, unquestionable. Albums appeared without promotion. Tours were announced late. Songs vanished from streaming platforms as if erased by will alone. If you wanted Prince, you accepted Prince on his terms. The same iron discipline ruled his image. Cameras were tolerated, not welcomed. Interviews were rare, brief, and often unsettling in their calm. He despised nostalgia and punished anyone who tried to trap him in the past. Old hits could disappear from setlists without explanation. Band members were replaceable, sometimes overnight, if they violated an unspoken line. Loyalty was expected but never guaranteed in return. He demanded silence about his personal life and enforced it not with threats, but with distance. People simply stopped being allowed inside. Paisley Park, his compound and creative sanctuary, became a closed universe. Inside, time bent to his rhythm. Recording sessions ran through the night. Musicians slept on couches, waiting to be summoned. Decisions were final, irreversible, often delivered without emotion. Prince could be generous, shockingly so, but generosity was another form of control. You were grateful or you were gone. Conflict followed him like static. Labels, managers, collaborators, even fans felt it. He distrusted systems, medicine, and authority, preferring faith and privacy over outside intervention. Pain, especially physical pain, was something to be managed quietly. He did not want weakness witnessed. He did not want vulnerability archived. By the final years, that isolation had thickened. Those close to him noticed changes that were hard to name without breaking the code of silence he had trained them into. He moved carefully. He relied on painkillers yet spoke little about why. Flights were interrupted. Performances were shortened. Explanations were minimal. Questions were unwelcome. In April 2016, the rules were still in place. Privacy above all. No spectacle. No public unraveling. What happened inside Paisley Park during those last hours was quiet, almost procedural, as if tragedy itself had been instructed not to draw attention. A man who had spent decades controlling sound, image, access, and narrative was suddenly unreachable, locked behind the very walls he had built to protect himself. Authorities would later reconstruct a timeline, but timelines don't explain why no one intervened sooner, or why warning signs were minimized, or why help arrived too late. Those answers live in habits formed over a lifetime, habits of secrecy, autonomy, and mistrust. The story does not end with the discovery of his body, or with official statements, or with posthumous tributes. It continues in unopened vaults, in legal disputes, in decisions made by others about music he never meant to release, and in the question that lingers unanswered. How much control can one person maintain before control itself becomes the final, irreversible rule? After the emergency, the machinery he had resisted for decades arrived all at once. Sirens, reports, procedures, statements. The quiet that had defined his private world was replaced by fluorescent light and paperwork. Yet even here, the rules he had set in motion continued to shape events. Information came out in fragments. Those who knew more said less. The building itself seemed to enforce it. Long corridors, locked rooms, a sense that every sound was being absorbed by the walls. Inside Paisley Park, nothing looked unfinished. Instruments were in place. Notes were labeled. Drives were catalogued. The vault, spoken of for years in half-jokes and reverence, sat sealed, its contents rumored to be vast, precise, and ready, as if he might return at any moment to pick up where he left off. It was not chaos that followed his death, but tension. Control had not vanished, it had become contested. Those closest to him were pulled into scrutiny they had never been prepared for. Old habits of discretion now looked like evasion. Decisions that once seemed respectful appeared, in retrospect, dangerously cautious. Why were concerns not escalated? Why were flights resumed? Why did no one force a pause? The answers were not dramatic. They were cultural. You did not interrupt him. You did not insist. You did not override. That was the rule and it had worked until it didn't. Pain became the central, uncomfortable thread. Not just physical pain but the management of it. He had spoken against dependency publicly, framed discipline as moral strength, and leaned on belief as armor. Yet those beliefs did not cancel the realities of a body that had been pushed for decades. Touring injuries, surgeries, a schedule that never slowed. Relief came quietly, privately, and increasingly often. The contradictions sat unresolved because contradictions were allowed, so long as they remained unseen. When the investigation began to narrow, it did so without spectacle. Dates, prescriptions, dosages, receipts. No villains, no conspiracies. Only systems meeting a man who had kept systems at arm's length. The most unsettling detail was not excess but normalcy. Ordinary transactions, ordinary logistics, ordinary delays. Tragedy unfolded not in a single reckless moment, but in a sequence of restrained choices, each one defensible on its own. Then came the estate. Control, finally, slipped from his hands and spread outward. Lawyers replaced musicians. Courts replaced studios. The question of intent hovered over everything. What did he want released? What was never meant to be heard? The vault was no longer a sanctuary, it was evidence. Every unreleased song became an argument between legacy and consent. Former collaborators spoke carefully, weighing memory against loyalty. Some described generosity bordering on myth. Others described fear, not of violence but of erasure. To fall out of favor was to disappear from the story entirely. Credits vanished. Relationships froze. Silence was retroactively enforced. Fans gathered outside Paisley Park, leaving purple flowers and handwritten notes, performing grief publicly for a man who had never allowed public access. The contrast was jarring. Inside the gates, restraint, procedure, uncertainty. Outside, music, tears, celebration. Two realities brushing against each other without merging. As months passed, new details surfaced, each one small, each one heavy. A cancelled appointment. A missed call. A delay that, in isolation, meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern that was hard to name without assigning blame, something the facts resisted. It was not neglect. It was not ignorance. It was adherence. And the vault remained closed. Decisions loomed about opening it, about reshaping a narrative he had guarded so tightly. Every choice felt like a violation, and yet doing nothing felt worse. Somewhere between preservation and exposure, the rules he built began to fracture, revealing not chaos beneath them, but a man still present in the margins, through checklists, handwritten notes, unfinished sequences, waiting, it seemed, for an order that would never come. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you like this story. What followed was not closure but exposure, slow, procedural, and deeply uncomfortable. The opening of the vault did not feel like discovery. It felt like intrusion. Engineers, archivists, lawyers moved through rooms that had once answered to a single will. Everything was labeled in his handwriting. Dates without context. Alternate takes without explanation. Songs finished, then abandoned, then finished again under a different name. It was clear that this was not a backlog. It was a parallel career no one had been allowed to hear. Those who listened first described something unsettling. Not nostalgia, not triumph, but urgency. Many recordings were recent. His voice was strong. The ideas were sharp. There was no artistic decline hidden in the vault, only momentum. The tragedy sharpened. He had not been slowing down. He had been accelerating, quietly, obsessively, as if aware that time had narrowed. At the same time, the investigation pressed forward with a tone that never matched public emotion. Clinical language. Confirmed timelines. The absence of a will turned everything fragile. Control, the principle he had protected more fiercely than any asset, dissolved into committees and court orders. Decisions were made by people who had never been allowed to make decisions around him while he was alive. Friends and collaborators began to fracture into categories he had once enforced himself. Insiders, outsiders, trusted, erased. Some spoke of warning signs they did not recognize at the time. Others admitted they recognized them and said nothing. Not out of indifference but respect. The most painful realization was how obedience had masqueraded as loyalty for so long that no one could tell them apart anymore. Paisley Park transformed. What had been a private nerve center became a destination. Tour routes replaced rehearsal paths. Visitors stood inches from rooms where music had been born at 3 a.m, under conditions that could not be recreated. The space survived, but its meaning inverted. Silence became explanation. Glass replaced distance. Meanwhile, releases began. Albums shaped by others, framed as tributes, marketed as gifts. Each one raised the same quiet question. Would he have allowed this? Some tracks felt unfinished in spirit despite technical polish, like sentences interrupted mid-thought. Others sounded complete enough to suggest he was waiting, not for inspiration but for permission or the right alignment of circumstances that never arrived. Accounts of his final weeks took on weight with repetition. The missed follow-ups. The insistence on privacy. The refusal to let concern escalate into intervention. None of it dramatic. All of it cumulative. The story resisted the shape of a warning tale because it lacked a single wrong decision. Instead, it revealed a system that had worked flawlessly, until the moment it mattered most. Fans argued over legacy. Was his strict control visionary or destructive? Was the vault proof of genius or of isolation taken too far? The debate itself felt like something he might have appreciated, had it not been about him. Even in absence he provoked structure, opposition, discipline. And still questions remained sealed. Not about how he died, that had been documented, but about how he lived in those final stretches, negotiating pain, faith, secrecy, and creation inside a world that had learned never to challenge his boundaries. The evidence existed, but interpretation stalled, caught between reverence and regret. Somewhere among the recordings not yet heard, the notes not yet deciphered, the plans never executed, there was a version of the story still in motion, unfinished not by design but by interruption, waiting inside a system that no longer knew which rules still applied. As the months stretched on, another pattern surfaced. One that hadn't been obvious at first because it was so consistent it felt intentional. Prince had been preparing but not in the way people expected. Not a farewell, not a retreat. He was reorganizing. Old tapes were rehoused. Session files were duplicated. Instructions were left without context, precise but incomplete, like directions written for someone who never arrived. It suggested urgency without surrender, motion without explanation. Those who had worked with him late at night remembered how often he spoke about timing. Not destiny. Timing. Release windows. Cultural cycles. Readiness. He believed music entered the world only when conditions were right, and if they weren't, the music waited, no matter how finished it was. That belief now haunted every posthumous decision. Nothing felt on time anymore. There were also contradictions no one could smooth over. He rejected most modern distribution, yet cataloged everything digitally. He distrusted institutions, yet built systems that only institutions could now manage. He avoided doctors, yet documented pain with methodical precision. The rules had become so elaborate that even he seemed to be negotiating with them near the end, adjusting without dismantling. Stories from the final weeks grew heavier with repetition. Rehearsals that ran longer than planned. Long silences between bursts of intense focus. A sense, reported by several people independently, that he was rushing, not in panic but with intention, as if aware that delays were no longer neutral. Still no one spoke directly. No one crossed the boundary. The culture he built held. Paisley Park, now opened and illuminated, revealed details that felt too intimate to be public. A pair of shoes left by a piano. Notes folded and unfolded so many times the paper thinned. Lyric fragments that never resolved into songs. They did not point to despair. They pointed to work interrupted. Legal battles intensified quietly, away from the purple tributes and headlines. Ownership, intent, authorship. Questions that mattered deeply to a man who had defined himself through control were now decided through language he never trusted. Each ruling felt clean, procedural, and somehow wrong. The gap between legality and loyalty widened. Fans continued to argue, but the arguments shifted. Less about how he died. More about whether his way of living, absolute autonomy, spiritual certainty, creative isolation, was sustainable at all. Younger artists cited him as a model. Older collaborators described the cost of orbiting him. Both were right, and neither resolved the tension. What remained most unsettling was how ordinary the final sequence appeared when stripped of myth. No collapse in public. No dramatic final performance. Just routine maintained too long. Privacy preserved past usefulness. Strength performed until it failed quietly. And beneath everything, the vault, the estate, the investigations, the debates, there lingered the sense that something essential had been paused mid-action. Not concluded. Not resolved. As if the story had been instructed to wait, the same way his music had waited for years, locked behind a rule that no longer had an owner to enforce it. The end did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a decision made without him. When the final investigative conclusions were released, they were spare and unemotional, facts arranged to close a file. No villains named. No grand failure declared. just a sequence of events that fit together too late. The tragedy was not hidden in excess or chaos, but in restraint carried past its breaking point. Pain managed privately. Authority deferred. Help kept at a respectful distance until distance became final. What unsettled people most was how consistent the ending was with the life that preceded it. Nothing dramatic interrupted the pattern. No confession, no collapse, no last-minute reversal of rules. He lived as he had insisted on living, self-governed, insulated, disciplined, right up to the moment when those principles could no longer protect him. The estate moved forward. Music was released. Some of it was breathtaking. Some of it felt unfinished in a way that no mastering could fix. The public received it as a gift. Insiders heard it as a question mark. Each release closed one door and opened another argument. Legacy expanded even as intention blurred. Paisley Park settled into its new identity. The lights stayed on. The rooms were preserved. Visitors walked paths once traveled by people who knew better than to ask questions. What had been a fortress of control became a museum of it. The silence inside those walls felt different now, not protective but commemorative. Over time the debate softened. Theories lost their urgency. What remained was a clearer, harder truth. The same discipline that allowed him to outmaneuver an industry, to protect his work, to remain singular for decades, also trained everyone around him to step back when stepping in might have changed everything. Respect became paralysis. Loyalty became hesitation. Control outlived its usefulness. In the end, there was no hidden message in the vault that explained it all. No final recording that framed the story neatly. Just work paused mid-motion, systems without a master, and a body of music that proved he was still moving forward when time stopped him. The tragedy wasn't that he died alone. It was that he lived so completely by rules only he could enforce, and when those rules finally failed, there was no one left who felt permitted to break them. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.